Right, hello guys, Luton here, and back for Below the Line. This is a series, comes out every Wednesday, where I discuss the games industry. I also look back at your comments from the previous video, discuss them here in this video. The way the format works is for the first section, I discuss your comments from the previous topic. At the end, in the second section, I discuss a new topic which you will comment on below, and then that follows on to the next week. And we were talking last time about how microtransaction systems are set to be bigger than EA, with companies like Take-Two saying they want to implement this kind of stuff across all of their games. S95 starts us off saying that he put up a response 3 days ago, but it disappeared. That's YouTube, sometimes it just happens. I very rarely remove comments from the channel now. He says it's way bigger than EA. Most AAA publishers are involved with some kind of microtransaction now. EA just happens to be the one that pushed the line too far and too fast. This is why I actually am glad that Battlefront 2 made their microtransaction systems so bad, because the industry has been pushing the line slowly for a long time, but because they pushed it slowly, step by step, not that many people were feeling threatened by it. Battlefront 2 is also a wake-up call for many people, because this is the first time that they've already realised that things can get this bad, and the amount of backlash is so big. He says even his sister, who doesn't play modern games, knows about this whole thing. I think that's why it's very pervasive, it's very widely reported across the industry. He says it will certainly set back many companies' plans for their microtransaction systems. I would imagine it will, but he says we're not safe yet due to the backlash. Most games currently under development are going to try to avoid becoming that next target, but after a while, after this is passed, they're going to be able to get back onto that, pushing the line again, and people are going to forget what has happened. I think that's true. He says, however, there is hope. History has proven that companies will change their policies if there's enough consumers pushing them, both with words and with their wallets. Consumer pressure is why many companies now publicly announce that they won't get their material from, like, let's say, child labour, or stay away from immoral business practices. They want to be ethical, essentially. And this is what the games industry needs, a united and sustained consumer pressure. It is a good point. I think there would be quite a big selling point about sort of ethics. When you look across the media now, there is a bit of a movement for media which push really pervasive things and often hateful things, and there is quite a movement now for sort of saying, like, hey, we as consumers don't want this, and if you're going to include this, we don't want to be a part of it, and making them more vocally heard. I mean, that's one of the things that's really good these days with, the really widespread influence of social media. People can actually put their views out there. Look at YouTube. I mean, YouTube actually starts off as an entertainment platform, and more it transitions into kind of almost social reporting, covering issues that affect people. There's many different ways in which this can be effective. So it is a really, really good thing. And, whilst people say, like, YouTube has been dying off recently because of the whole advertising thing, I still think that, that there's an element with YouTube that doesn't exist with Twitch, which is with YouTube you can produce essentially like a program, whereas Twitch is very much kind of on the fly, it's live, you have to kind of, roll as it comes along, you have to improvise, you have to think on the fly about what you're talking about, what you're doing, whereas with YouTube it's much more produced. It's more like creating a program, especially if you do something regularly, and it's the kind of thing people tune in for, like a television program. So I think there is a difference there, and I think, so what we're talking about is this idea that you can kind of create content and push a social commentary out there for people to kind of take on board, and companies to be aware of, because they are aware of this stuff. They have whole departments, like in marketing, who kind of have to look at, well, what are people talking about? What is trending? What's the discussion? How is this affecting us? So it is a good point to make, that I think if companies made it very clear from the outset that they had a strong ethical stance on these kind of things, then I think it would be a big selling point, and I think it would be something that help people get on board. And I actually encourage developers to do that. Be vocal about your perspective on these things, and I think you will see consumers flock to you who are like, we are on board with this, we support you. You may even see, if you're doing a Kickstarter campaign and you make it very clear that you're making a product, you want to sell that product, and you're very kind of open and clear about what it is, people will come to you. People want it. That's the way consumers work these days. Okay, I think the millennial sort of generation, I think a lot of companies still often don't understand how to market and sell to a millennial generation. A millennial generation, what they want is, here's the product, here's what it does, here's what it costs. That's it. That's what you need to do. You just say what your thing is, you say what the price point is, and that's it. you know, and then people make up their own determination. If it's a good product, they'll buy it. People, you know, the marketing bullshit of years gone by just doesn't wash anymore, and companies should just not, you know, this whole Star Wars Battlefront thing is an example not of necessarily marketing BS to a degree, but it's, you know, it just shows that when you really try to take the piss, people can see through the bullshit, and they have done here, and they have put the hammer down. Now, I usually post just single comments, but Husker, I wanted to include the start of this conversation thread where he says, I feel sorry for DICE. They put so much effort into their games and EA rips the heart out and replaces it with slot machines and season passes. We have seen it with the Battlefield franchise and now Battlefront. EA are poking around, trying to judge what people find acceptable and push that more and more. They're now using the go all in and slowly dial it back tactic with Battlefront 2, allowing them to set it at the most profitable margin without hurting sales. Unfortunately for them, the gaming community has had enough and fought back, but is that what they wanted? A backlash, allowing them to increase public relations and make themselves look good by saying, we're listening to the community. I honestly don't believe a word from them, because I know what extent they're going to for maximum profit, and I think he's supposed to say something else there. But then Elusive says, EA and DICE have now become intertwined and the devs are not blameless. I think it's true to a degree. I mean, you know, DICE decided to work with EA, and that's basically like saying, well, hey, we're partnering up with you. You can't then just wash your hands of it and say, well, we've got nothing to do with it. I mean, you're literally business partners, so you can't just say, oh, it's all EA. I don't think that's the case, and I find it laughable when I see other producers and people like this going like, DICE are listening, oh, they're listening. Yeah, of course they're bloody listening. They're listening to try and figure out like how they can get around this issue. And if they were really listening, they would have listened to how pissed off people were in the beta, and they'd have gone, holy crap, this is a bad thing. If they were really listening to us, they would understand the community and would have realised that quite some time ago that this would have been an incredibly terrible idea. Digital Bath then says, I'm sorry, also the gunplay, squad play, game modes and almost anything about the last two Battlefront games is mediocre. They're casual shooters with great graphics and overall presentation, but that's really about it. I would totally agree. He says, even with the whole loot box crap, they're boring as hell after a short time, and that's definitely DICE's thing, not EA's. I sadly agree. Battlefront, from my point of view, the main thing about it, it's just boring. And that's surprising because the graphics are so lush and inviting and just amazing experience. But that's what it is. It's kind of, I've said this before, it's kind of like you can have an amazing game experience with astonishing graphics that, you know, pulls you in, and plus if you love the Star Wars universe, you're going to love all that stuff. But in terms of the actual gameplay, there's very little with it. And I'm sure that some people would disagree. I disagree with you. I find that you generally run around, you just blast shit in front of you, and that's about as far as it goes. You know, yeah, you got your cards, power-ups, blah, 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 blah. I just find it's all much of a watchless. Like, I just don't, it just kind of all blends together, and you just like, there's so few memorable experiences, you know, it's just kind of, you just like, oh yeah, in another round, blast, 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 round's over, next round, blast, 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 next round, and it's just repeatable, forgettable, and you get bored of it. I actually, during the time period where we had like, you know, just before release, I actually kind of in that week forgot to come back and play the game because I was so bored of it. Like, I'm not even joking, I was doing other things and I meant to get on and play for like 5 hours, 6 hours, just completely forgot about it. Okay, Andrew Joy says, this is bigger than EA. The big devs like Activision or Blizzard with Overwatch or EA with Battlefront follow trends. Look at the number of clones of COD we got as soon as COD was super popular. It's the same with this. They see the crazy amounts of money that free-to-play and mobile games are making, and they want some of that fat cheddar. The higher-ups of the publishers don't know about games as anything other than another form of media to sell, and that's what's popular, and try to chase that demographic and ignore the others that they think don't exist. A few years ago, I was told many publishing executives only know of 3 games: Clash of Clans, Call of Duty, League of Legends. Heroes from shooting from COD and the monetization from Clash of Clans, bake it all together onto a winner, and their MA from business school so tells them. Another part of this problem is the insane amount of money that's spent on developing games now, so they try to justify this by saying that they need the money to cover the costs. Well, why not just stop spending money like it's water, focus your budget better, and you'll come out with a game that's just as good, if not better, that you can charge less for. He says also, love your 40k stuff, waiting for more. Yeah, I know about the 40k stuff. Yeah, the thing is that this idea that they need it to cover the costs is being pretty debunked at this point. Like, if you look around on YouTube, multiple videos back up with data, it's just shown not to be the case. They don't need to put all these systems in place to make their money. I mean, games games are still selling at a really, well, actually, we'll talk about price point a little bit later, but basically, they make enough sales to make big profits. EA makes a shit ton of money, and this idea that they somehow need to have this stuff, this idea that they're on like a, on a knife edge, and that they need this stuff to just make any profit is just frankly complete bullshit. It's just not true. So that concept is just fundamentally flawed. But yeah, so this idea of they need to balance it, but no, they don't need to balance any budgets. They're fine, they're fine. But for sure, games like Clash of Clans and stuff like this, these mobile systems, they do look at how these games are raking in the money, and they probably do make a jump there. They probably look and go, well, hey, look, we're making our games and we just sell them like this. These guys are making these other games and they're raking in these money, and they're probably making the connection that, hey, there's people that are willing to spend it on this, so if we put it on our game, they're probably willing to spend it on this, and it's probably like a no-brainer from a executive business perspective. They're just like, this is going to be like free money for us, like 100% do this. But again, they're probably misunderstanding the demographics there. Right, everyone, Jiro's back, so buckle up with another big comment. He says, I think the problem is the entire industry. I made a post about this on another video, so I'm going to make this one here. It might actually be seen. He says the problem is it's psychological to gamers. Gamers have become, if you really look into how they're designed, and gamers react, a digital Skinner box. And for those who don't know what that is, it's basically you put a rat into a box with a button, and every time the rat pushes the button, it gets a treat. And that's the very simple basic of it. But the psychological effect of it is that to train the rat, so that if it wants a treat, it pushes the button. So later on, you can get that rat to push the button whenever it gets seen. Does that sound familiar to some of you? Let's substitute some of the words. It's basically you put a player into a game with microtransactions. Every time the player buys a microtransaction, it gets a reward. That's the very simple basic of it. But the psychological effect of it is to train the player so that if they want a reward, they buy the microtransactions. So later on, you can get the player to buy microtransactions whenever it is seen. This is a really good point to make. And also it reminds you that, when I first started playing Star Wars Battlefront 2, when I would come back to the menu, it would have a huge pop-up which is reminding me that I have a crate to open. So they actually had pop-ups in the in-game menus saying like, hey, look, you've still got a crate, come open your crate. This is what I mean, it's really pervasive. He says we've actually seen this before already in the gaming industry, and where might you ask? With pre-orders and special editions. Today people no longer freak out over pre-orders or special editions unless the rewards are not good enough. They don't care that pre-orders and special editions are a stupid anti-consumer problem and that the rewards at the end of the day are meaningless and worthless. It's just the fact that it has a reward for them. Microtransactions even have seen that effect take hold too. It's now okay to most people as long as microtransactions are cosmetics. This is something I've said now over a few videos, but I still have a kind of, I do feel like it's okay to a degree. He says they've already had a psychological effect on most gamers. The original was that people were saying it's okay as long as it's just cosmetics, applied only to free-to-play games. The reason being that the business model to free-to-play games would need those microtransactions to pay for itself. This is a fact. But it only works with free-to-play. You can't then apply the free-to-play business model to every game, and it's utterly stupid that people have allowed it to happen. And again, it's not just consumers, it's YouTube producers push these rhetorics, streamers push these rhetorics as well. He says, back on track, my point in all of this is psychological talk, is that video games have basically now become a drug. It's become weed, it's heroin, it's alcohol and cigarettes. He says, sadly, having my brother die a month ago due to heroin, I can tell you straight up that no matter how much you yell or logically explain the issue to people with these kind of addictions, they don't listen. You would have to forcefully remove these objects from them, and even then they're going to try and do anything and everything to get it. And that's become video games now. As people have ranted, and I've ranted before, everybody yells loudly that I'm not going to buy this game, but at the same time, they're pre-ordering the $150 collector's editions and buying all the DLCs and season passes. It's a drug people cannot get away from. They all say that they're going to stop and that they're not going to play that game. It's too addicting. They crash, they crumble under the pressure, they give in, and they give companies and devs their money. Now here's the big difference between those bad physical objects and bad digital objects. Drugs, alcohol and cigarettes, they've got laws regulating, banning, restricting their use. Video games barely have any laws at all. They basically have the copywriting stuff, and that's about it. They can put anything into a video game. There's no laws, no regulations, no standards, no committee, or anything that can really go into a video game and go, no, that's too anti-consumer. There's nothing at all. Not quite true, but anyway. Video games have, ironically, too much freedom, and when it's a good thing, that freedom can also be a bad thing. Sadly, we're seeing the dark and the evil, again, that might be a stretch, side of video game companies having too much freedom about what they can put into a video game. So what I would say to this is, I think it is a little stretch to say that it's as bad as like a drug addiction, because that's a physical chemical dependency. What I do think is true is that with these kind of systems, microtransactions in games, and just people's habit of saying, oh, I'm not going to do this, and then buying the game. It's a habit. It's a habit. It's like a kind of just a regularity. People get used to a thing. They get used to wanting a thing. But games in and of themselves, their nature is addicting. You know, games, when you think about how games just fundamentally function in terms of mechanics, games themselves are addictive by their own nature. And so the idea of having something which is addictive combined with then putting microtransaction systems into it, maybe even sort of soft gambling stuff into it, that in and of itself is a pretty terrible concept, because the base product itself is pretty addictive, but then you're adding other stuff into it. I mean, honestly, think about it. How many times have you kind of felt like, you know, one more game, one more game, one more game, one more game? It's addictive and it's a habit, but it's not the same as like a chemical dependency. I also do think it's a big stretch to call companies evil, because I personally have a fundamental problem with people being referred to as evil in general, like whether they're a criminal or whatever, because the concept of something evil is, I always find that principle a little bit flawed, but that's a whole topic for another day. But yeah, just when you think about gaming, I mean, I have sat here playing Overwatch till like 1 a.m, 2 a.m, and then I think, oh, one more game, one more game, one more game. Next thing I know, it's 5 a.m. You know, it's like, that's how games are. And I as a person, I find games extremely addictive. I can sit and play games for like 7 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours. I can easily sit through a huge gameplay session like that. It's like sometimes people like come on and they say like, oh my god, you're still streaming? Yeah, it's like sometimes I get into a game and I just can't get off of it. You know, like RimWorld is a good example for that. Sometimes when I get into RimWorld, there's always just one more thing to do, one more thing to do, one more thing to do. You just can't get away from it. And that's where the issue with microtransaction systems come in, and why it's so pervasive. Because when you have a game at its base level, like I say, which is fundamentally addictive, and then this thing kind of like invades that space, you don't get away from it. Do you know what I mean? It's always there in the background, and sometimes you might just feel like, oh, you know what, I just want to kind of, maybe I'll try it, you know. You put in all the hours and you think like, oh man. And this is where Star Wars Battlefront 2, the real issue is. I actually even think that the real issue with Star Wars Battlefront 2 is not, it's the data that the guys looked at on Reddit, where they found that it wasn't so much even about the crates and all this kind of stuff. It's more about the actual time that you need to unlock stuff, because that's the thing. Everybody kept saying, oh well, you can unlock stuff when you level up. Yeah, except that if you were taking like a kind of average amount of playtime and an average, you know, just looking at a kind of base average level, it could take you anything like 4 years to unlock everything. And that's where the real bullshit is. That's where they're fucking you over, and that's where DICE have like a big say in this, because they make the game, okay, and they must have someone somewhere has sat around, and I always try to keep this, you should visualize this, guys, when you're thinking about anything to do with marketing and games and just advertising in general, okay? Just remember this: someone somewhere has sat around a table and had a discussion and decided and signed off on these things. These things don't just happen by random chance. All of this stuff gets discussed, approved, signed off on, and it doesn't happen just in an instance either. There will have been multiple iterations, they will have tried out different stuff, and they will have come to a consensus on what they want and how they want it to be, and there will be rationalizations and logic behind why those things are there. So the fact that Star Wars Battlefront 2 came in with an extremely slow upgrading process in terms of what you gain out of each round, right? That is not a mistake. That is not something which happens by chance. They have done that deliberately to try and make people feel frustrated by the slow progression and then feel more likely, more inclined to buy the crates and the loot boxes. So you see, it's not just the crates being in the game which is the issue in and of itself, it's the decisions that are made around that, and it's disingenuous of YouTube producers, streamers, commentators to try and make out that this is not the case. It is the case, and everybody can see it, and that's why people are pissed off. It is not just people overreacting. People are not just overreacting because, oh hey, they have to maybe pay a little bit extra for it. That isn't the case. And quite honestly, I think I remember on Twitter talking with like 2 Angry Gamers this week, just in an instant, and they were saying like that they were surprised that companies haven't cottoned on to the fact that they could just put in like physical skins into a game and charge money for it, and people would pay it. Yeah, I actually think if game devs and stuff were more upfront about just selling stuff, and we're just like, hey, we've got some really shiny, nice skins, they cost like $2.50, $5 each, whatever. Do that. I am actually okay with that. And I know some people would say, oh, hey, O2, you know, what the fuck? No, listen. If you put a shiny skin into a game and you just say, hey, like, this is a cool skin, costs like this much, you want to pay that much for it? Go for it. It's just a skin. Like, you either want it or you don't. And at least it's like upfront and there's no BS. Do you know what I mean? Like they're just, you know, it's on the table. It's like, here you are, here's the thing. If you want it, you want it. If you don't, you don't. Now, of course, no way am I advocating that should relate to like physical objects like guns, weapons, or any kind of mechanical systems. But if it's just cosmetics, yeah, you know, I think that's okay. I don't think it's necessarily okay that cosmetics can bleed in onto sort of necessarily like loot crates or stuff like this. Which we see in Overwatch as well. But on the other hand, like I've said, I do think the concept of selling cosmetics in-game, I know some people disagree with this, and you know, it is like quite an older school mentality, I think, but things do change. You know, I think this idea that like you buy the game and at base level everything is in the game, well, you know, yeah, I mean, that has always been the way, and it is the way for a long time, but I don't think there's any issue, providing they're not, for example, skimping on actual content in the game already, and again, that's quite subjective, but providing they were not skimping too heavily on just kind of what was accessible at base level. You know, let's say they had 10 skins just by default or something, right? And then they have like 50 skins to buy. Yeah, I think you're going to say it's BS. But let's say it's like 50-50, or maybe even like 60-40, or even 70-30, whatever. You know, if there was just kind of like, providing you had more at the base level than you were able to purchase, I think that'd be alright. You know, I think that'd be okay. Just providing they were clear-cut about it, it didn't influence the game's mechanics. Again, it's debatable, but I think it would be okay. The main thing would be that they would have to come out and say, this is the limit. You know, they'd have to be upfront about it in their advertising and stuff and say like, yeah, look, we do have this stuff for you to buy, but that's as far as we go. You know, this is my concern that I've talked about before, is this idea that it's a slippery slope, and once they start to do it and people get used to it, then they go, okay, no, well, now we're going to just do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. So that's where you got to be careful with it. Right, back to you guys, and Pado says, this wouldn't happen if the ratings organizations properly rated these games with randomized loot crates and called it what it is, gambling. This unfortunately might never happen because the game industry is self-regulated, and it appears that the supposedly independent rating boards are somewhat biased in favor of industry over consumers. What a shocker. Honestly, it's time for governments to step in and threaten rating boards with governmental oversight before they'll finally step in to do so, as they should. However, it is interesting, isn't it, that we have seen this week, both in the US and Europe, countries and governmental officials actually saying that they are calling this stuff gambling. They are saying that they are potentially not going to allow it, and this is becoming a wider issue. This has actually gained momentum, and it is pretty interesting because if these things go forward, and so it's, you know, people are going to debate about like, well, government shouldn't get involved in, you know, businesses, blah blah blah. It totally depends on where you live. I think obviously in the US people have this idea that, you know, it's you know, companies do whatever they like, they should have much more free reign. Well, over here in Europe, that's not generally how it's seen. Over here, we tend to see things more that, you know, the government is there to protect us, the government is there to get involved and give protection for consumers, to give regulation on an industry and prevent it from being abusive and trying to get around these things, trying to be sneaky. Now, you know, again, there's a whole wider issue that you can get into here, but that's the fundamental hub of the matter. I think the US to Europe is always quite different in the way it kind of approaches these things, but the interesting point is that, for example, in Europe, if one country or a couple of countries decide that they're not okay with this, it's probably going to spread across the board, and then, you know, you're going to have big companies going, crap, now, you know, for example, okay, having DLC is one thing because you can kind of tack it on or not, but when it kind of actually gets into the game mechanics like they did with Star Wars Battlefront 2, well, you can't just switch that on and off. You know, if it's designed into the fundamental core of the game, which is the biggest problem with Star Wars Battlefront 2 as well, if you have that in place, that's not something you can just turn off, and it means they'll fundamentally have to redesign their games. And also the other thing is that that's going to be if they're even allowed to use these systems, because from what we've been seeing the last couple of days discussed, it's looking less and less likely like they're going to be able to get away with this stuff again. And even if they were able to, again, what you got to remember, a big company like EA, are they going to roll the dice on, hey, we're going to put this stuff in, and then maybe not, it gets approved? No, you're going to probably have to hedge your bets and be very careful about what you put into your games, especially if, you know, there's actual governments and politics and stuff getting involved and saying, like, this is not okay. They're going to be very cautious about what they put in from here on out. And I think just from the reaction alone to Star Wars Battlefront 2, they'll be already very cautious going forward. So, you know, maybe things are actually going in a really positive direction for the consumer. Okay, Ollie Rigney says, the microtransaction system problem is bigger than EA. It's just that EA has been at the forefront of it because they're the ones that have been making the more controversial decisions with regards to how they've decided to implement their MTS. And any time that other producers have peeked out from behind EA's shadow, they've found themselves in the spotlight for their own dirty MTS methods. They found themselves being criticised too, for example Shadow of War. The reason it doesn't happen more often is because EA seems to get the most attention because of all the let's hate EA bandwagon, which while I agree that EA have some really shitty business practices, they're not the only ones doing it, they just seem to have gotten the most blame. And yeah, I do see MTS continuing to be a thing in 2018 purely because not everybody has decided to boycott games with MTS or other similar money-making practices yet. Therefore, the big companies will keep the systems in their games until people cop on and MTS is no longer profitable. He says, thanks for doing this series LT because even if it's only once a week, you're still getting the word around, providing a place for intelligent conversations to be held in the comments. Yeah, the conversations in the comments, guys, are as always really, really great, so thank you for all of your contributions. I do think that, as I just said, we're sort of seeing the tides turn, if you will, towards, you know, not having these systems in games, and it could well be that actually in 2018 we actually don't see so much of this stuff. Let's hope. Okay, next up, AI Mods, who says, I feel so sorry for every employee who works with passion and effort on a game that's then being ruined by the company for the greed of more money. Not saying companies shouldn't earn money, but microtransactions are just a massive rip-off. This business impacts in many ways. Just imagine that you've worked on a game like this, something huge, something that seems sure to succeed, and it's also Star Wars. You put a lot of effort into it, you believe you're creating something epic, but meanwhile, the guys who probably don't even play the games are just making terrible decisions behind closed doors, and on the release day you find out that the past just years, I think you're supposed to say, were wasted or something like that at the end. Well, I mean, this has always been the paradox for me, you know, because I tell you what, I get caught by this time and time again. You know, when I actually speak to developers, when I actually speak to guys on the ground, it's like developers are always like the best people. They're super passionate about their game, they love their game, they'll talk to you about all the stuff in it, and you can see how much they love it, and you can see how much work and effort they put into it and how much they care about it. And then suddenly, what you talked about, the game comes out, bang, it's whatever they said was just, you know, not true or bullshit, or it got screwed around with. And you often, I just really often feel frustrated by that. But often I also think it's kind of like, it's just not their fault. You know, it's not their fault. You know, they might be there and working on it and all the rest of it, but ultimately, they don't make the ultimate decisions. It's higher up people that are making those decisions. So it's not on them. The other thing is I just don't think people often appreciate how bloody hard some of these people work. I mean, they really do work hard. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who works in like special effects editing, like graphics and so on, for some pretty big movies. Like he worked on Ex Machina, he's worked on Hunger Games and stuff like this. He's worked on some big movies. And again, I know when they're really in their crunch time where they have to sort of work solidly almost for like a few weeks or whatever, they really fucking work hard. Like they are ground into the ground to get that stuff finished. And it's much the same with games. You know, if you're working on graphics, if you're working on any kind of details in the game, there's going to be periods where you've just got to bust your ass. And again, I think it's really sad when people have to work that hard. They probably feel really good about what they're doing, and then you see the reaction you get to something like Star Wars Battlefront 2, and it is just not their fault. So yeah, it really sucks. And again, quite personally, if it was me, like if, again, this is just personal, but if it was me, if I was working for a company and they did something like this with the game and I'd worked incredibly hard, I'd just be like, do you know what, I'm out, I'm done. You know, I'd go work on an indie game, or I'd do something else which rewarded me more, because I would just feel like, oh man, you know, what was the point of all that? Right, coming up to the end now, Roman says they saw the backlash from the community. They've done this to stop the game being a complete failure at launch. He's talking, of course, about them retracting the microtransactions from Star Wars Battlefront 2. He says Disney may have applied some pressure to them to make changes to the system due to feedback, and my concern is that we haven't won anything and that they're going to work out another way to work this game into the future, which they've kind of said that they're going to do. He says, how do I explain to my nephews that this is wrong and they shouldn't be buying the game? As far as they're concerned, this is a game they want to play. Worst still, with this becoming the standard with all games, they're going to accept microtransactions are part of their gaming experience. This is what I've been saying. It's not about people's personal experience right now. It's how it's going to affect people that are more influenced by this stuff, and how they're going to see it along the line, and how it's going to become the norm. This is what I keep saying. It's not about what just you're getting from the game at this exact time. It's bigger than that. He says they're not going to see it in the same perspective as we do, and hence they're not going to think it's that bad. He says Obi-Wan said everything's dependent on a certain point of view. So while EA and other developers have lost the current battle, they're going to win the war. This is much the same that we had to accept that games moved away from being standalone and required an internet connection to play current games. Change is coming, and unfortunately we're going to have to learn to accept this as the future. I would say with the conversations that we've seen this week from, again, some politicians and stuff, maybe not. Maybe not. There is a glimmer of optimism about where this goes in the future. Okay, last one for today, Lightside Master. This statement should be literally translated into, and he was talking about the statement from EA saying about how they're retracting their microtransactions. He says this statement should be translated into, we're really sorry that we didn't get away with this. And it's like, yeah, absolutely, that's what they're saying. He says, we don't listen to anything that you say, but we've seen many people cancel pre-orders and we want our money. So yeah, we're going to turn off microtransactions. And when everyone was dumb enough to buy our game by Christmas, we'll turn it back on, possibly as bad as they were before. Yes, this. It's so true. And this is why I found it so laughable when I started seeing like the DICE fanboys this week, going like, oh look, they're listening to us. How stupid are you? Just like, you fucking read between the lines. Like, it's so obvious that they're not just doing it because they're listening and they care about the community. It's so obvious. You don't want to be too cynical, but for Christ's sake, it's so obvious. Like, people are pissed off. The game is just about to release. They want to make sure they sell as much as possible. They want to calm the waters. They want to pour water onto the fire. They want to calm everything down, get their sales, and then turn it back on again. Don't be a fucking idiot. It's so obvious where they're coming from. So yeah, I'm sorry, but anybody that just come out and was like, oh, they're listening to us, wake up. So, now we come to part 2 of the series, and this is where I pose a new discussion point for you guys to reply to down in the comments below. This week we're talking about the pricing of games, the price that we pay. Would you be willing to pay something like £100, $150 for a AAA game title? Would you be willing to pay more than that? This is quite a detailed area of discussion, and it all comes off the back of the loot crate shambles around Star Wars Battlefront 2. There's been analysts this week saying gamers should be paying a lot more for games than they are right now. Quite the contrasting view to what most gamers say when stating that the industry standard of around $60 plus DLC leading to over usually $100 outlay for games is actually too much. The discussion point in some articles this week has been that on a dollar or pound per hour ratio of entertainment, gaming still comes in as one of the cheapest, when you compare it to, say, going to the movies. This is often the comparison that you get given. However, what you got to remember, movies have pretty high overheads. The cinema's got to make its money, so does the film company, so on. Whereas other things like gaming and, say, Netflix are pretty much a digital platform, so they don't have those overheads. And also, when you compare your cost of entertainment per hour from a game to something like Netflix or, a subscription like that or Amazon Prime, the cost per hour doesn't actually seem so dramatic as it does when you compare it to a cinema trip. So I think cinema trip, I don't know why that gets given as like the base entertainment comparison, but when you look around at other stuff, it actually doesn't really stack up. Even so, is the price that we're paying for games at the right point currently? Now, I was also thinking today about software. Other software not related to gaming can be very cheap now, depending on what it does, but other software can be priced much higher. Look at stuff like video editing software, things like this. Now, it's not comparable to games because, for one, you're often buying a license for that software so you can work with it. So the sphere isn't the same, you're there's a different kind of demographic and functionality there. But I found it's a helpful thought that the prices out there vary for the products, and that it isn't perhaps so far-fetched to imagine prices changing when it comes to gaming. Something that I do find interesting is when you look at stuff, for example, like the Adobe Creative Suite, stuff like Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, things like this. Those used to be a massive price point. They used to be we're talking hundreds of pounds to purchase the license to use that software, which is why people often used to borrow it from friends and so on. But now that they've put that online, and you can basically purchase a subscription for it, suddenly it's become more affordable, more accessible for many people. And so there is a point to say, well look, if we're saying that games should actually cost more than their current price point, maybe we should think about other options, again, like subscription models, and that's a whole other discussion to have. Now, another interesting factor that I was thinking about this week was also inflation. Now, if you don't know what that is, I'll try to summarize it briefly. What inflation is, the best way to think about inflation is it's just simply the average price that products rise by over time. So it's, for example, why a Mars bar, chocolate bar, cost 10p in the 80s, but today it costs 70p. Now, your first thought might be, well, this is an outrage. Why do these things get more expensive? Well, the thing is, in truth, they don't. Inflation is actually a really healthy thing for an economy, and it's all a balancing act that hopefully a country's government, if they're competent, should keep in check so citizens continue to afford living at a reasonable standard. However, it's not as simple as to just say things get more expensive over time. There's plenty of other factors which can affect the price of something. Things like distribution costs, a more globalized economy, and a changing consumer demographic. Now, when it comes to consumer products, supply and demand can also be a factor, but with games in the age of digital downloads, the concept of supply and demand doesn't really apply. But it used to be, and you might have forgotten that this is why pre-orders actually existed in the first place. Pre-orders were a thing that came about because when game sales were still primarily physical, there were distribution and simply limitations on stock. There were not enough physical copies of a game out there for everyone to get on release day. So the idea was you would pre-order to essentially reserve your game. And you see how it is where people get used to something. So initially there was actually a good reason for pre-ordering because you would want to make sure that you actually had your copy of the game at release. Well, then suddenly things went digital and the companies were like, hey, people are used to pre-ordering, why don't we just kind of move it sideways? Do you see how these kind of things happen? But more amusing was that pre-orders originally required usually no money down. You were just kind of reserving it. So if on the release day you weren't there to pick up your game, the store would just wait for a bit and then just sell it anyway. But also, amusingly, I recently found an old game review book of mine from the 90s, and it's basically just reviewing games, and it covers a variety of games from the kind of mid-90s. I was really shocked to see that games like Sonic & Knuckles, Echo the Dolphin, and Urban Strike by EA was selling from anything like £25 to £50. I think Urban Strike was like £45, but there were other sports games as well that were like £50, even more. And that's from like 1994. So yesterday, whilst I was out at the supermarket, I passed a stand selling Star Wars Battlefront 2 at £50. So isn't it crazy that nearly 25 years later, we're still paying out about the same price for a top title game? Still, this idea that entertainment is something that can be just assigned a value and then scaled off of some baseline is fundamentally flawed. It's just nonsense, basically. Most entertainment is quite personal and subjective as to what you actually enjoy, and some of those genres are going to have a bigger following than others. So while we can look at price points and discuss the merits of changing distribution costs, larger expenditure of production, much larger audiences than 20 years ago, and easier updating with DLC models that previously never existed, it ultimately comes down to what are people willing to pay. As I've always said, it's not something that can be just determined. When people say to me, Luton, is this game worth getting? I usually say, well, I don't know if I can tell you that. I can tell you I like it and what the features are and if I think it's a competently designed game, but worth is not really something that I feel should be included in a review or an overview of the game. It's why I don't really like 10 out of 10 reviews either. I don't like that model, because worth is completely situational. What something is worth to me might not be worth it to you. My disposable income may be different to yours, and what I value in a game may also be different to you. So this is why it's interesting that with all the rationalizations you care to make, it doesn't change the fact that £50 25 years ago should still probably have bought you a lot more than it would today. So it's quite bizarre that we still see that as a sort of vague benchmark price for a AAA title, especially when you consider the sheer epic rise in design, scope and content that games offer now. Some of you watching this are not going to remember the days of cartridge gaming, and many more are going to remember it well. But if you were not gaming back then, you're just not going to appreciate just how far games have come and how much they offer now. I mean, basically, back then in 1994, a lot of games didn't even have a save functionality. I mean, I also submit that people simply do have more disposable income these days. I mean, who doesn't have a smartphone? You know, and these often cost many hundreds of pounds. Everybody seems significantly better off than 20 years ago, so I do find it bizarre that the cost of games has not even risen above the same price we were paying all that time ago. Maybe that is why companies now feel the need to include so many invasive systems to try and peel people's money away from them. Again though, who determines how much money a company should make? It's debatable that the sheer volume of sales from now versus then could offset it. Still, I think from some data we've seen recently, they seem to be making absolutely plenty of money. So the question of the day is, do you think we should be paying a higher initial price for games? Would you pay anything like £100 or more even for a big title of the year? Or would you prefer something like a subscription model where you say pay £10 a month? And then, you know, because this was the point that was made, if you pay out a much higher price, if you pay a bigger price for a game at release, but then the player base drops off or the game isn't what you thought, well, you're out of pocket for that big price point. But what if they made the price point lower for the actual base game itself, but then you pay the subscription on top of that? So let's say the game was more like £20 for a big title, but then you paid a £10 subscription for multiplayer per month ongoing throughout the year. Well then, say 3-4 months down the line and the community drops away, well, you know, you got your base game and then the multiplayer itself you kind of played for a while but it's dropped off and then you just unsubscribe. You know, would that model be appealing to people? Of course it would probably be conditional as well that DLC was free, so keep that in mind. And when you consider the time that you plow into that product, and if it meant that we didn't see things like aggressive pre-order marketing, like I say, free DLC, even developers having to implement mechanical systems to slow people's gameplay down, baiting them towards loot crates, if we got rid of that bullshit, you know, would that idea of paying be more appealing to people? Or is it just a flat out no? And, you know, again, I will actually make the point, I'm not necessarily advocating any one system one way or the other, but what I will say is it's not usually constructive if people have too closed a mind to these kind of things where they're just like, no, I just, this is it and I'm not going to move. I mean, we see that in everything these days where people are just like, literally, they will swear that black is white, you know, so it's not helpful to have a discussion where people won't even, you know, talk around the issue and sort of go, well, do you know what, I can actually see that there's some positives there, but there's some negatives there as well. You know, I used to play WoW and, you know, I used to subscribe to that. You know, you pay like £15 a month to play the game on top of buying the game in the first place. So it's not something which hasn't worked. I mean, WoW is an incredibly popular game. It was and it still is. And that model had existed for a long time. Now, I think a lot of people argue as well that the free-to-play model is the better direction now. Make a game for free if you want to implement all that other stuff, but personally I hate the kind of free-to-play model because it literally requires these kind of transactional systems in games, and I just think that that's a dangerous road to go down. I would much rather say, like, here's a game, we make a good quality product, pay a base price which is not too expensive, and then subscribe for a multiplayer ongoing experience. I'd be much more on board with that personally myself, but again, tell me what you guys think down below. This is Below the Line. It's posted every Wednesday, guys. Tell me your thoughts about this topic down below as always. If you enjoy the series, please drop me a like on the video. It helps me out, it helps the channel out. See you guys next week for some more Below the Line.